At 5:47 a.m. on August 23, 1944, Private Jack Morrison was crouched behind a destroyed wall in a French village near Falaise, holding something that made his superiors laugh until they cried. It was a slingshot. A damn industrial rubber slingshot, 40 centimeters wide, and he intended to use it to destroy Panther tanks. His colleagues called him crazy. Sergeant Davis had said the night before, "Morrison, you're going to die trying to throw rocks at a 45-ton tank." But Morrison wasn't going to throw rocks. He had 6 modified M26 grenades, 300 meters of open field in front of him, and 25 Panzers from the 2nd Panzer Division advancing directly toward him. What happened over the next 3 hours would become the most absurd and improbable story of World War II. It was a story that generals would try to bury because it was too embarrassing to admit, how a single soldier with a homemade slingshot destroyed an entire column of German tanks and changed the outcome of a battle. The story of this slingshot had begun 6 weeks earlier, on July 12, 1944, when the American 28th Infantry Division became isolated near St. Lo. Morrison and his platoon were out of anti-tank ammunition, surrounded by Panthers, and watching their colleagues being massacred. They had grenades, but they couldn't get close enough to the tanks to throw them. Panthers were steel monsters, 45 tons of armor with a 75mm cannon capable of destroying any Allied tank from 2,000 meters away. Their frontal armor was 120mm thick. Even anti-tank grenades exploded uselessly against them. But Morrison, an Oklahoma farmer who had hunted rabbits since he was 8, had an insane idea. What if he could hurl grenades from a distance with precision? His father used slingshots to scare off crows at 50 meters. Morrison thought, why not use the same principle? The problem was that an M26 grenade weighed 600 grams. No ordinary slingshot would hold up. He needed something industrial, something impossible. That night, Morrison searched the wreckage of the village and found exactly what he was looking for: rubber belts from a destroyed German truck, the type used to tension heavy engine components. The rubber was thick, elastic, and incredibly strong. He cut 2 strips of 1 meter each and looked for a frame. In an abandoned workshop, Morrison found a metal fork from a wagon, welded 2 reinforcement rods, and attached the rubber strips to the ends. The central pouch was made from saddle leather. The result was grotesque, a slingshot the size of a medieval bow that required immense strength to arm. Morrison tested it in secret, first with rocks. At 30 meters, he could hit a German helmet hanging from a tree. At 50 meters, he still had reasonable accuracy. But grenades were different. He took a deactivated training grenade and fired. The first attempt hit the ground at 20 meters. The second flew 80 meters but without any control. The problem was balance. Grenades are not perfect spheres, and irregular rotation made them veer off course. Morrison had an idea. What if he tied the grenade with thin string to the slingshot pouch to create stabilization? He tried again. This time, the grenade flew in a straight line and landed exactly where he aimed at 60 meters. But there was a critical problem. M26 grenades had a fuse of 4 to 5 seconds after activation. If Morrison pulled the pin, armed the slingshot, and aimed, he would have at most 2 seconds before the grenade exploded in his hands. The margin of error was 0. A second of hesitation and he would die. Morrison practiced obsessively: pull the pin, arm, aim, fire. Everything in less than 3 seconds. His record was 2.4 seconds. His colleagues watched him with a mix of admiration and horror. Private Pete Harris said, "Morrison, you're either a genius or suicidal. I haven't decided which yet." Morrison just smiled. On August 22, the 28th Division received orders to advance to Falaise, where German troops were surrounded but still resisting fiercely. Intelligence reported that the 2nd Panzer Division was trying to open an escape corridor with 25 Panthers. The American mission was to block the road. But they had only rifles, machine guns, and grenades. No anti-tank weapons. Captain Williams gathered his men and said, "Gentlemen, we are going to face 2 squads of Panthers with what we have. Prepare ambushes." Morrison raised his hand. "Sir, I have an idea." When Morrison explained his plan, Captain Williams looked at the slingshot and stayed silent for 10 seconds. Then he laughed. He laughed so hard that other officers came to see what was happening. "Morrison, you want to face Panthers with a slingshot? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." But Williams was desperate. "Fine. Try it. God help us." On the morning of August 23, Morrison positioned himself behind a stone wall 250 meters from the main road. He had 6 M26 grenades, his absurd slingshot, and a clear view of the battlefield. At 5:45, the Panthers emerged from the morning mist, their tracks crushing everything in their path. 25 tanks in column formation. Morrison waited. The first Panther passed. Then the second. He needed a stationary or slow-moving target because hitting a moving tank at 60 meters with a slingshot was practically impossible. Then he got lucky. The third Panther stopped to adjust its route, its tracks turning slowly. Morrison took the first grenade. He pulled the pin. The fuse hissed. 3 seconds. Morrison armed the slingshot, stretching the rubber with all his might. 2 seconds. He aimed at the rear of the Panther, where the engine was exposed by ventilation grills. 1 second. He let go. The grenade flew in a perfect arc, spinning in the air. The distance was 58 meters. The grenade landed directly on the engine grill and exploded a fraction of a second later. The explosion wasn't huge, but it was enough. Fuel leaked, the engine caught fire, and a column of black smoke rose from the tank. The crew evacuated in panic, screaming in German. The other Panthers stopped abruptly. Over intercepted radio, the Americans heard the confusion, "Führer im Motor." Was ist passiert? Fire in the engine. What happened? The Germans didn't know if it was a mortar, a plane, or hidden artillery. Morrison didn't wait. He took the second grenade and aimed at another Panther that had stopped 50 meters away. Pull, arm, aim, fire. 3 seconds. The grenade flew again. This time, it hit the side of the tank where external ammunition boxes were stored. The secondary explosion was devastating. The Panther's turret was blown off by the force of the internal detonation, and the tank turned into a burning furnace. Now the Germans went into total panic. They couldn't identify where the attacks were coming from. There was no cannon sound, no bazooka smoke trail, just sudden, lethal explosions. The German commander ordered immediate dispersal. The Panthers began to move in all directions, looking for the invisible enemy. Morrison had 4 grenades left. He moved 30 meters to the right. A Panther turned toward him, its 75mm cannon rotating slowly. He ducked and waited. He waited for the tank to pass, then stood up and shot it from behind. Third grenade. A direct hit on the rear where the armor was thinnest. The explosion pierced the fuel compartment. The Panther stopped, smoking, and the crew jumped out before the tank exploded completely. 3 tanks destroyed. 3 grenades. The American soldiers watching from their trenches couldn't believe their eyes. But Morrison had no time to celebrate. Other Panthers were advancing. He ran to a new position, stumbled over debris, and nearly dropped the slingshot. His right hand was bleeding from pulling the rubber so many times. He didn't care. 4th grenade. Another Panther. Another hit. By the end of an hour, he had used all 6 grenades. 6 shots. 4 Panthers completely destroyed, 2 severely damaged and immobilized. The Germans, unable to identify the source of the attacks and believing they were under fire from hidden artillery or planes, retreated. The column of 25 Panthers turned back, leaving their destroyed tanks behind. When Morrison returned to the American lines, his colleagues received him in stunned silence. Captain Williams looked at him, then at the slingshot, and said, "Morrison, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I'd never believe it." Sergeant Davis, who had mocked him, shook his hand without a word. The story spread through the army like wildfire, but it was quickly suppressed by high command. Officials considered the story too embarrassing. A soldier destroying Panthers with a slingshot sounded like exaggerated propaganda. The official report listed the tank kills as unidentified artillery fire. Morrison survived the war and returned to Oklahoma to farm. He never spoke publicly about the slingshot, but he kept the rubber strips for the rest of his life. When a local journalist asked him about the war in 1978, he simply said, "I learned that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective." His story remains one of the most improbable of World War II. It wasn't advanced technology, it was desperate creativity, insane courage, and a farmer who refused to accept that tanks were invincible.